Hi, this is Joe Zaza with ASD Management. We're going to move to part 3 of our series on ambulatory surgery centers. And we're going to talk today about pre-development activities. One of the things I like to say quite often is surgery centers are successes or failures before they're built. And the planning phase, what we call the pre-development phase, is absolutely critical. So we're going to go through the key drivers on what makes a good surgery center successful during the planning phase. I want to start with the first thing, which is that what makes an ASC successful? Well, it's volume. You have to have enough cases to make these things work. You could be the best football coach in the world. You could be Nick Saban, but if you don't have the players, you're not going to win. And in our world, it starts with volume. You have to have enough cases to overcome the relatively high fixed costs of running a surgery center. When I say high fixed costs, that means overcoming the construction cost or rent, the equipment cost, the staffing cost, because at the end of the day, you're going to still have to have staff whether you do 10 cases or 300 cases, insurance costs and all those. So volume drives surgery centers. Proper planning around that volume drives surgery centers. For example, if you have overly optimistic projections and you build too big of a surgery center, you're going to have a much higher overhead than you would if you build it properly. Or if you build too small, you're going to have a real problem on into the future. So proper planning is absolutely essential. You also have to have systems and people and leadership. Now we think about this, and we'll talk about this during the development section, but at the end of the day, you have to have a way of running your surgery center systematically. And we're going to go through all of those elements, but this is really a people business. And having the right people in place makes these centers successful. So let's start with how we would start planning a surgery center. And the first thing I would do when I got a phone call from a client is I will speak to them and say, hey, tell me where you're located, tell me what you've got cooking and all that kind of stuff. And they'll say, well, we've got some physicians and these physicians are interested in a surgery center and we're the hospital and we want to see if we can put a venture together. And the first thing I'm going to ask is that, all right, which surgeons are interested by specialty? What is their payer mix and how many cases do they currently do on an outpatient basis? And then we're going to start planning around that. Now, why is that important? Well, it's important because you size up the surgery center, how big it should be based on the number of cases projected to be there. Now, we project typically conservatively 60% to 80% of what they do can actually be done at the surgery center. And we typically run 3 scenarios to do that. Sometimes the client will send you procedures, which would be CPT codes versus cases, and there needs to be a conversion done because many times a patient is cases and many times a patient may have 2 procedures done, and if that's done improperly, you're going to miss on your revenue based on the way Medicare and the payers pay. So that typically they'll pay for the first procedure, but they'll pay 50% for the procedures thereafter. And if you just count procedures, you're going to overstate your revenue. So that's one of the important things we want to talk about. So we want to develop a grid by specialty with how many expected cases they're going to do, and then affix what we think is going to be net reimbursement for that specialty based on the market conditions. Once we've put that together, then we kind of have a better feel for how big the center is going to be, and then we can build a staffing model. So we're going to then build a staffing model based on the number of cases being done. You have to have business office staff, you have to have surgical techs, you have to have pre-op and post-op recovery, and you have to have OR nurses, and you have to have sterile processing people and other support staff. And that then needs to be built based on your volume estimates. You also need to estimate your supply and drug costs, and that does in conjunction with your volume estimate. So like, for example, if an orthopedic surgeons collectively are going to do 500 cases a year, you need to have your fixed supply costs based on orthopedic cases to be a corollary to that. And then you need to see what kinds of cases they're doing, because if they're doing joints, like total knee repairs and stuff like that, it's going to be a lot more expensive than if they're doing just plain and simple arthroscopy. So you've got to kind of bifurcate by specialty. Pain management's the same way. If they're doing spinal cord stimulators, those are going to be a lot more expensive than if they're just doing pain injections. So you kind of got to be real precise with your the way you put your estimates together. So now that we've estimated our supply and drug cost, and we've estimated what we're going to have in terms of staffing costs, then we need to size the center and project its location. That's a whole separate discussion, not for today, but certainly where you put the surgery center is extraordinarily important. And it's very important that you get your hospital and your physicians involved in that decision. I always tell the clients, this is going to be fun. These projects are a lot of fun, but they get to build their own clubhouse, if you will. And so you really want the physicians and the hospital buying into this thing, not just financially, but emotionally. So it's really important to talk about where it's going to be located, how it's going to look, and things like that. But you're going to size your surgery center based on your estimated volume. And what I would recommend, and we constantly recommend this to our clients, is that figure out how many cases you think you can do from a maximum standpoint, and then build one extra OR. That doesn't mean you're going to equip it, but you're going to build that extra OR. And the reason you want to do that is that if you ever have to add on to that center, it's not just the 600 foot or 500 square foot OR, it's the preoperative recovery space that goes along with it and the downtime that you're going to get into. So the extra cost of building one extra OR is not that much in the scheme of things. So that's something that it's really important. So now we've sized our center. We've developed our staffing matrix, as I said. We've developed our revenue and supply cost matrix. So now we're kind of beginning to see the financials come together, and which is extraordinarily important. So once we put that together, then we're going to develop a sources and uses of funds, which is going to be, how much equity are you going to put in versus how much debt, and how is it going to be financed? Another key question is on the real estate side, and I should have come to this earlier, is are you going to go off balance sheet and have a real estate developer develop the project and then lease it back, or are you going to build it yourself? And there's pros and cons, all right? Both work extraordinarily well, but it just depends on what your equity appetite is, how much equity the physicians and the surgeon and the hospital wants to put into the venture. Now, a couple of different options. One is to have a separate real estate company that the physicians may own with the hospital or on them by themselves, and then lease it back at fair market value to the surgery center operating entity. Or you could have a third party lease it back, or the surgery center joint venture could own the land and the building itself. Or finally, the hospital, if it's a hospital joint venture, could build the building and lease it back. All of this has to be done at fair market value, and a third party valuation firm must be brought in for compliance purposes. Financing surgery centers. So we talked just a little bit about sources and uses of funds. What's it going to cost to start up a surgery center? Well, you're going to have pre-opening salaries. You're going to have pre-opening supplies. You're going to have legal and accounting fees. You're going to have licensing fees. You're going to have development fees to hire somebody to get this thing up and running and licensed. You're going to have to put a down payment on equipment, perhaps. And you're going to have real estate fees if you don't use a third party to build it. And typically you're going to have to put 20 or 30% down on the land and the building if you're going to own the land and the building yourself. So you've kind of got to build back into how much equity you need based on your financing assumptions. Equity in the surgery center is very, very important. Highly leveraged surgery centers put themselves at in a very difficult position. We believe it's important to have a lot of equity, as much equity as you possibly can in the center without overburdening the partners. But we typically like to see 30% equity and 70% debt in in the perfect world in a surgery center. We typically see the equipment almost 100% financed, the about 20 to 30% put down on the land and the building, and then the soft costs, development fees, pre-opening supplies, salaries, that kind of stuff, legal fees, is part of the equity. So you've got to build an equity debt model. I would start with debt, figure out what you're going to do on the real estate, figure out what you're going to do on your equipment. That should be your only debt, and then build back into your equity that way. The last thing on the sources and uses of funds, and maybe the most important, is working capital. Cash is king. You must open up with at least 6 months of working capital. It is essential, because what's going to happen is the first 6 months of the center, you're going to do your first case, you're going to wait to be licensed, you're going to then wait to get your Medicare number, then you're going to wait and get on your managed care contracts, and that process takes 6 to 9 months. During that period of time, you can do some cash paying cases and maybe some out-of-network cases, but you're not going to be fully operational, which is good because it allows you to burn in the surgery center from a developmental standpoint and an operational standpoint, but you're burning cash during that period of time. Very important that you talk to your bank about that and try to have interest only for the first year on your loans. But you must have a significant amount of cash in the bank in order to open. Working capital is essential. And feel free to call me or write me about that, because it is the difference between success or failure with many surgery centers. So in closing, to develop your financial projections, you want to first estimate cases. Then you want to build a staffing, revenue, and supply matrix based on those assumptions. You want to figure out your real estate. Do you want to go off balance sheet, or do you want to own the real estate yourself? You want to prepare sources and uses of funds and figure out how much debt versus how much equity. And then at that point in time, you can prepare your income statement to see what you project the center how the center to do. Now, I would run 3 different scenarios. I would run a startup for year 1, kind of a baseline for year 2, and a growth model for year 3. It's extraordinarily important to show the bank and your partners and manage expectations. It usually takes a year for the centers to get up and running and mature. So the first year is almost like pre-season, if you want to put it in a sporting type sense. Burn that culture in that first year. Make sure you've got a place you want to operate at, and make sure you have a place that fits your needs. And if you have enough working capital and you've planned it properly, you're going to be in a great position to move forward. So that concludes this first section on pre-development, and I hope you enjoyed it. And again, feel free to email me with any questions at asdmanagement.com. Thank you.